This video is about phalloplasties, and my goal in this video is to describe what it is and then describe how it's done. I'm going to come back a little bit later and talk about my personal sequence of events, which you can look in a separate video. So let's talk about what it is. So a phalloplasty is a surgical procedure in which we harvest tissue from elsewhere in the body to make an anatomically appropriately sized penis. And as we take that tissue, we disconnect it from its blood supply, keeping the nerve, artery, and vein intact, and redo all those connections after we've reconfigured that tissue into a penis and connected up down below. The other part of the phalloplasty, at least technically, is very similar to a metoidioplasty. So we're lengthening the urethra, we're taking out the vaginal canal, and then we're making a scrotum and also making a more male appearing perineum, or making a longer perineum. So we couple the longer phallus with kind of the same sequences that you would get in a metoidioplasty, but you end up with an anatomically more appropriately sized phallus that will allow you to have an implant placed later to have penetrative intercourse. The next part I want to talk about is, where does that tissue come from? And so the first thing that you'll find is that in most centers or practices, there's really two surgeons doing the phalloplasty. There's a reconstructive urologist, and that's who I am, and that's what I do. And we often work together with a microvascular plastic surgeon, which I do as well. And ultimately, where that flap comes on will depend on a conversation between yourself and the microvascular plastic surgeon. But the options really are the following, and I'm briefly going to go through the pros and cons with each. So the forearm. The pro of the forearm is it has great blood supply, it has great nerve supply, so good ability to have sensation, and it's not thick tissue, so the width or the girth of the penis is almost perfect. So you get good sensation, you get a good size, and you get a good thickness. The next option is something called an ALT, or a thigh flap. So it comes from the outside of the thigh. It has the good nerve and blood supply, but the tissue of that flap is much, much thicker. So we can't really make it thin in the first surgery because it can hurt the blood supply or the survivability of that flap. So it increases your risk of having other surgeries or revisions after that big upfront surgery to make it more narrow, so it's really more compatible with penetrative intercourse. The same thing is true of the last flap, which is called the latissimus dorsi, or an MLD flap. The bad thing about that flap is the nerve supply isn't good. That's what we call a motor nerve, which is meant for movement. And it also has a poor sensation relative to the other two flap, and the girth is actually thicker as well. So generally that's the last choice of a flap. But the good news about the thigh and the back flap is they're a lot easier to conceal. So guys who are really hesitant to proceed with the radioforum flap, it's because that scar is noticeable. And that's the reason why a lot of people shy away from that. But at the end of the day, it has really great blood and nerve supply, so the sensation is good, and it has less tendency to need revision because it tends to not be that thick of a flap.